All right, so today we are going to be talking about historical fiction, which is exploring history through creativity. It's probably one of my favorite genres, and it's most likely one that you are already pretty familiar with, but you may not have known that that's what you are reading. So, what is historical fiction? Historical fiction is a literary genre that reconstructs past events into fictional stories. It takes things that happened in the past and it adds on to them, mixes them with made up events and made up people in order to tell a stronger story. The most important part of historical fiction is the setting. For any historical fiction story, you need a strong setting and one that is centered because your entire story has to be centered on a historical event, possibly a person, but that even then is a time period. And the setting must take place in the past. Now, a lot of literary scholars debate what makes something historical fiction and how far back in the past it has to be. Generally accepted is about 35 years. Some people say 25 years, some say from the 1950s back. Um, but it really depends. Does not mean the story itself was written 35 years ago. You could write a story today that takes place in World War I, and it's historical fiction. So the setting has to be strong, and then the characters are typically a mixture of real people and made up characters. And that's because when we are researching a historical event, we often know the key players. We know some of the most important people there, but we don't necessarily know everyone they spoke to. So when we're talking about Major League Baseball, more in like the 1940s, and you think of, well, we know who Jackie Robinson was. We don't necessarily know everyone he sat next to on the bus and what he said to those people as he went to the next game. But an author can create that story to help paint a picture or to teach us more about a time period or a person. So, when we talk historical fiction, there are several features that are pretty prevalent through all historical fiction books and stories. And there are 6 features that we're going to talk about today. Some of these I've already discussed, but we can kind of brief through them. Setting, like I said, the events either actually occurred or they could have occurred in that setting. Same with characters. The characters either actually lived or they could have lived in that time and place portrayed. So when they say they could have lived or it could have occurred, there are lots of things that could have happened, but you have to use some common sense. So if we're writing a story about the Renaissance, we know Michelangelo existed, and then we know there were other painters that didn't become as famous. So you might have Michelangelo speaking with another painter. That is very plausible. You cannot have them talking about the astronaut that they painted because that would not make sense, right? So you have to kind of find a way to build it so that it makes sense within it. Which leads us to accuracy. Accuracy means the story takes place in an authentic historical setting. It's been researched, it makes sense, everything seems to fit together. And then there's perspective. The story is almost always told from a first person or a third person point of view. Remember, first person is the person telling the story has action in the story, and they're telling it as if they saw it. I did this, then we did this, next I went with them to do this, that kind of thing. Third person is they witness the story. They're telling it as they see it. First Sally did this, then she did this. Next they went and did this. Dialogue. The dialogue in historical fiction is typically made up for the most part. And this is for good reason. Unless we have actual recordings or videos of a conversation that took place, then we don't know word for word what was said. So if you're doing something about a president in the 60s or 70s, a lot of times there are videos and recorded conversations, and you could use that dialogue. But again, if you're writing a story about Michelangelo, you're going to have to look into letters that he may have written, notes and reports he did, diaries, and then build a conversation from that. What makes sense that he would have said? What would he have likely wanted to speak about? What was on his mind? What was he passionate about? That kind of stuff. And sometimes authors just do this to help move the plot forward and help tell their story and get across the message they want to get across. And finally, there's going to be a conflict. That's a problem within the story. At least one character is going to have a conflict, whether it's with themselves, like they're trying to make a decision, they're at odds with something, maybe they have a conflict with other people, or maybe it's nature and they're fighting against the forces of nature. Overall, these 6 features and 6 elements are prevalent and important for building your own historical fiction. In order to build historical fiction, authors are going to have to be committed to doing research. We don't want to be reading a story where we find something that's out of place, because that kind of just bugs you the whole way. I don't know if you've ever been watching a movie where you see a plot hole and then the rest of the movie that's just stuck in your brain for a while, and you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. That couldn't have happened. I don't know why they did that. And you can't enjoy the rest of it, or you can't believe much of what else is said because of that one mistake. Well, the same thing happens when you're reading historical fiction. So authors have to do a significant amount of research in order to maintain historical accuracy. They have to look into the events, they have to look into the people, the things they would have said, the places they would have gone, what they would have worn, what they would have eaten, what they would have done. So, just like that little bug that kind of gets stuck in your brain when you're watching a movie, when you're reading, the same thing happens. All your text evidence and details. Remember when teachers ask you, how do you know that was the answer? And you have to go back to the passage and find how you knew it was the answer? That's your text evidence. All those text evidence and details have to be able to point to the correct historical setting. They have to be able to point to the correct historical figures and people. And if something is off, it's going to mess up the credibility for the rest of the story. So because of that, historical fiction is considered a form of realistic fiction because of its emphasis on accuracy. So often in younger elementary, you just learned fiction and nonfiction. Real, fake. But there are so many subgenres within fiction even. Realistic fiction means something that could have happened. So in historical fiction, the events happened in the past, they could have happened, but it was a long time ago. Realistic fiction is when maybe it's a story about a high school team that goes off to the championship last year and they won. All likely, all could happen, all real things that you could see on the news, could happen within your own school, whatever it might be, plausible. A typical fiction that you think of as, young elementary is a 9-foot tall talking flamingo, right? That's not something that we're actually going to see. So realistic fiction is stuff that really could happen. Historical fiction is a form of realistic fiction. It just takes place within the past. So one of the purposes of historical fiction, yes, is to entertain us, but also to teach the reader about different things. For example, it might teach you about the cultural significance of certain things during that time period. It might teach you cultural practices, beliefs, ideas, religion, whatever it might have been common during that time period. So if you're reading a story that takes place in ancient Greece, it's going to be common for them to talk about the gods and Zeus and Aphrodite and Athena and Poseidon and looking for protection from these gods because that was such a strong part of their culture. It's not something that's as prevalent today, but it would have been important then. There would have been a significance. If you're learning about settlers coming to the United States, you might have them meeting different native tribes and learning the language and the customs and getting to know people because that was culturally significant. So you can use historical fiction to teach about other cultures within history. Another aspect that's really important, in my opinion, of historical fiction is the perspectives. So Authors often get to teach about historical events through different perspectives or from a whole new approach. History, they usually say, is told from the perspective of the winners, right? The winners in a war are the ones telling the story. And so they automatically are the good guys, the losers are the bad guys, and they have to tell the story from that perspective. But that's just not true in life. If you and your best friend get in a horrible disagreement and argument, and you're yelling and fighting, and I were to come separate you and ask you both what happened, you likely will have two very different stories, and it's not necessarily because one of you is lying, but just how you saw the events that happened to you. You both are going to be telling the story from your perspective, your lens, how it made you feel, or what was done to you, and not necessarily what you did in return, right? That's difference in perspectives. It doesn't mean somebody's not telling the truth. It just means they saw things differently. And perspectives can shift and change. If we are being very honest right now, let's take World War II as an example. We often see it as Americans as we are the good guys, the Nazi Party were the bad guys. Yes, the Nazi Party did horrific things. But even within that Nazi Party, first of all, the leaders that did the most horrific things, some of them I think knew that they were doing evil things. But some of them truly believed that they were doing things to help society within their own sick, twisted version, right? So they thought that they were helping. They clearly were not. But the low man on the totem pole, the average German soldier, had no idea about how bad things were or what was actually happening. And so their perspective would have been, we're the good guys, we're fighting for our country, we're trying to help people. And a lot of those German soldiers and people that were part of the Nazi Party, years after the war, sometimes just a couple years after the war, when they were told about the things that were happening, they were shocked, they were horrified, and they just felt guilty because all along they thought they were the good guys, right? So seeing things from a different perspective changed their view. They went from thinking that they were the good guys to seeing it from the other side and seeing, we did wrong. We did not do what we thought we were doing. So, perspectives can be a whole new way. It's often interesting to read, say, a war book from different perspectives, opposing sides. Not always the victim, but maybe the person inflicting something, right? So seeing why people do things the way they do, that can be important and a new way to learn things. So historical fiction teaches the reader about events and people through new eyes. And finally, it's a genre that comes in all forms. So any form of storytelling that allows the creator to combine real and made-up events in order to teach about a historical event can be historical fiction. It does not just have to be a novel. It could be short stories, novels, chapter books, picture books, comic books, anything that takes real events in the past and combines them with made-up people and events in order to tell a story and to teach you more about the past. So that's historical fiction, and now we are going to start reading some of our own historical fiction novels, and you'll get to see this play out in real life.